I used to believe strength was something people noticed. That if you carried enough weight, someone would eventually see your hands shaking. My name is Iria, and for most of my adult life, I was the person others leaned on without asking if I could stand myself. Every morning began quietly. I would wake before the city stirred, sit at the edge of the bed, and breathe for a moment before the day claimed me. There was comfort in those few minutes of silence. No expectations. No voices asking for advice, reassurance, or calm. Just me, reminding myself to keep going. People often told me I was good at handling things. They said it with admiration, never realizing it was a habit built from necessity, not choice. When my workplace became tense, I was the one smoothing conversations. When friends felt lost, they came to me, unloading their fears like bags they no longer wanted to carry. I listened. I always listened. Kalen, the man I shared my evenings with, believed my calm meant I never needed support. He would talk endlessly about his worries, his frustrations, his plans. I nodded, offered careful words, and kept my own thoughts folded neatly inside. It felt easier that way. If I spoke, I might fall apart. There were moments, small, almost invisible, when the weight pressed too hard. Like standing alone in the kitchen late at night, staring at the sink filled with dishes, feeling tears rise for no clear reason. I would wipe my face quickly, ashamed of needing anything at all. I told myself this was adulthood, responsibility, maturity. Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice kept asking the same question: who holds the strong ones when they finally grow tired? The first crack appeared on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing dramatic. No argument. Just exhaustion that refused to stay hidden. I had spent the day helping everyone else. A colleague needed advice about leaving her job. A friend called during lunch, crying about a relationship she didn't want to end, but didn't know how to save. By the time I reached home, my chest felt heavy, as if I had been breathing someone else's air all day. Kalen was on the couch, scrolling on his phone. He looked up and smiled, the familiar comfort of routine settling between us. He asked how my day was, the question automatic, almost polite. "Fine," I said, like always. But this time, the word tasted wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I set my bag down. I waited, just a second longer than usual, hoping he might look closer. Notice something. Ask again. He didn't. Instead, he began talking about his own stress, his own fatigue. I listened, nodding, offering soft responses while something inside me slowly withdrew. It wasn't anger. It was realization. I saw myself clearly then. Not as strong, but as invisible. Not because others were cruel, but because I had trained them not to see me. I had made space for everyone else and disappeared into the margins of my own life. That night, lying awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and felt a deep, unfamiliar sadness. Not heartbreak. Grief. Grief for the version of myself who believed being needed was the same as being loved. I wondered when I had last been asked how I truly felt and whether I even remembered how to answer honestly. For the first time, I didn't push the thought away. I let it sit with me, heavy and uncomfortable. Something was changing slowly, quietly. And I knew there was no going back to pretending I was fine. Change did not arrive like a storm. It came like a slow ache, the kind you ignore until it affects the way you walk. I began noticing how often I swallowed my words, how frequently I adjusted my tone to make others comfortable. It wasn't just with Kalen. It was everywhere. At work, my manager, Elric, praised my reliability. "You're steady," he said once, tapping my desk lightly. "We need people like you." I smiled, thanked him, and accepted another task that wasn't mine. I stayed late that evening, finishing reports while the office lights dimmed one by one. As I packed my bag, a strange thought surfaced. If I stopped being steady, would I still matter here? On the train ride home, I watched my reflection in the darkened window. I looked tired, but composed. Always composed. I wondered when I had learned that showing fatigue was a weakness instead of a truth. Small moments began to unsettle me. A friend, Lisa, canceled plans again because she needed to talk things through with someone else. I told her I understood. I always did. But after the call ended, I sat alone on my couch and felt a hollow space where connection should have been. I wasn't angry at them. That was the most confusing part. I was angry at myself for teaching people how to treat me. For never saying, I can't hold this today. For believing love meant availability without limits. That night, I opened my journal, something I hadn't touched in years. The pages were blank, intimidating. I wrote one sentence. I am tired of being strong. The words startled me. They felt honest in a way my spoken voice hadn't been in a long time. I closed the journal, heart racing, as if I had confessed something forbidden. But underneath the fear was a quiet relief. I had finally told the truth, at least to myself. The following weeks felt different, though nothing around me had changed. The same routines. The same conversations. But inside, I had stopped numbing myself to the weight. Kalen noticed I was quieter. He asked if something was wrong, but his tone carried no space for a real answer. I shook my head. Just tired, I said. It was true, but incomplete. One evening, he forgot an important date we had planned weeks ago. When I reminded him gently, he apologized quickly, distracted, already moving on. I felt something settle inside me, not resentment, but clarity. I saw the pattern clearly now. Not neglect out of cruelty, but comfort built on my silence. Later that night, as he slept, I sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker. I thought about all the times I had postponed my own needs. All the moments I had chosen peace over honesty. I wondered what would happen if I stopped doing that. The idea frightened me. Who would I be without my usefulness? Without being the one everyone relied on? The next day, Lisa called again, upset about the same problem she had been circling for months. As she spoke, I felt my chest tighten. When she paused, expecting reassurance, I took a slow breath. I can't talk about this right now, I said softly. The words felt heavy but necessary. There was silence on the line. Then confusion. Then a quick goodbye. After the call ended, my hands shook. Guilt rushed in, sharp and immediate. But underneath it, something else grew, something unfamiliar but grounding. Respect. Not from her. From myself. I realized then that change wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be built from moments like this. Uncomfortable. Quiet. Honest. And I was finally ready to keep going. The silence that followed my small acts of honesty was unsettling. Fewer calls. Shorter messages. I hadn't expected the quiet to feel so loud. It made me question myself constantly. Was I being selfish? Cold? Difficult? The doubts crept in during the spaces I had just created. At work, Elric noticed I was leaving on time more often. Everything okay? He asked, not unkindly. I nodded. I'm managing my workload differently. My voice was steady, but inside I was bracing for disappointment. He paused, then shrugged. As long as the work gets done. That was it. No lecture. No fallout. The fear I had carried for years felt suddenly exaggerated, almost unnecessary. One afternoon, I declined helping a colleague fix a mistake she had made. I explained calmly that I had my own deadline. She looked surprised, then nodded and walked away. No anger. No drama. I sat there afterward, stunned by how ordinary it was. Yet at home, the distance with Kalen widened. He sensed the shift, but didn't know how to name it. We spoke less, not because of conflict, but because I was no longer filling every silence. One night, he asked, "Did I do something wrong?" The question hung between us. I could have softened it, reassured him, returned to what was familiar. Instead, I chose honesty. I don't feel seen, I said quietly. I've been carrying a lot alone. He looked confused, defensive even. You never said anything. I know, I replied. That's part of the problem. It wasn't a dramatic conversation. No shouting. Just two people realizing they had been living different versions of the same life. When it ended, neither of us felt resolved. But something had finally been spoken aloud. That night, I cried, not from pain, but from release. I was no longer disappearing to keep things comfortable. And even if it cost me closeness, I knew I couldn't go back. In the days that followed, I began noticing myself more. The way I felt hunger instead of ignoring it. The way I rested without justifying it. These were small changes, but they felt radical. I started therapy quietly, without telling anyone. Sitting across from a stranger, I struggled at first to speak about myself without redirecting the conversation. The therapist noticed. She asked gently, "What happens if you don't take care of everyone else first?" The question left me speechless. I didn't have an answer. Only a tightness in my chest and a familiar urge to deflect. But over time, words came. I spoke about being dependable. About being praised for strength while feeling hollow inside. About confusing endurance with love. Kalen and I continued living together, but something essential had shifted. He tried to listen more, but it felt awkward, almost forced. I realized then that growth doesn't always move at the same pace for two people. And love, when tested by honesty, either adapts or fades quietly. One evening, after a long pause filled with unsaid things, I told him I needed space. Not to punish him. Not to escape. But to finally hear myself clearly. He didn't argue. He just nodded, sadness in his eyes. That was when I knew the choice was right. Moving into a small apartment alone felt terrifying and freeing all at once. The first night, the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. For the first time, I wasn't strong for anyone else. I was simply present. Standing by the window, city lights below, I felt something settle inside me. I wasn't broken. I wasn't difficult. I was learning slowly, imperfectly, to be enough for myself. And that felt like the beginning of something honest. Living alone rewired my days in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was no one to perform strength for, no one to anticipate before they spoke. Mornings were slower. I learned how I liked my coffee when I wasn't rushing to be useful. I noticed the quiet rituals that belonged only to me, stretching near the window, letting sunlight warm my face, sitting with thoughts instead of outrunning them. Yet independence didn't erase loneliness. Some evenings, the absence of shared routine pressed hard. I would reach for my phone out of habit, then stop. Not because I had no one to call, but because I was learning to ask myself what I actually needed. Sometimes it was conversation. Sometimes it was rest. Sometimes it was letting the feeling pass without solving it. Therapy became a steady anchor. I spoke about guilt, the kind that appears when you stop overgiving. My therapist said something that stayed with me: "You didn't change. You stopped abandoning yourself." The words landed softly, but they reshaped how I saw my past. Friends reacted differently to the new boundaries. Some drifted away without explanation. Others adjusted, awkward at first, then more respectful. Lisa eventually apologized for leaning too heavily on me. I didn't feel triumphant, just calm. Relationships, I realized, reveal their shape when pressure changes. One afternoon, I ran into Kalen by chance. We spoke politely, carefully. He told me he was learning to listen more. I believed him. But I also knew that listening wasn't the same as meeting me where I stood now. We hugged goodbye, and I felt gratitude without longing. Walking home, I understood something clearly: growth doesn't erase love. It changes its form. And sometimes, the bravest act is letting something be what it was, without forcing it to follow you into who you're becoming. As months passed, my life didn't become extraordinary. It became honest. I still had hard days. I still felt tired. But the fatigue was no longer soaked in resentment. It was the kind that comes from living, not from disappearing. At work, I was respected differently. Not as the endless solution, but as a person with limits. I contributed with intention, not obligation. The praise meant more now because it wasn't built on sacrifice. I began reconnecting with things I once loved quietly, writing, long walks, sitting in cafes without a purpose. In those moments, I met parts of myself I had neglected for years. Not because I didn't care, but because I thought caring for myself was indulgent. One evening, journaling again, I reread the sentence I had written months ago. I am tired of being strong. I added another beneath it. I am allowed to rest without explanation. The realization didn't come with fireworks. It arrived like acceptance. Strength, I learned, isn't endless giving. It's knowing when to stop, when to speak, when to leave, when to stay. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could hold for others. I measured it by how gently I treated myself. And in doing so, something unexpected happened. People who stayed began meeting me more honestly. Not because I demanded it, but because I modeled it. Standing in my quiet apartment, city humming beyond the glass, I felt steady in a new way. Not invisible. Not overextended. Just present. For the first time, I wasn't strong for everyone. I was whole for myself. The seasons shifted without asking my permission. Summer softened into cooler evenings, and with it came a deeper awareness of myself in motion. I noticed how my body responded differently to the world now. My shoulders no longer stayed tense by default. My breathing felt fuller, less guarded. These were changes no one praised, but they mattered more than any approval I had ever received. I started saying no without rehearsing explanations. At first, my voice still wavered, but I didn't retreat. Each refusal felt like placing a small stone in the foundation of a new self, one built slowly, intentionally. I learned that boundaries weren't walls. They were doors I chose when to open. There were moments of doubt. Nights when old habits whispered that I was becoming distant, unkind, replaceable. On those nights, I sat with the discomfort instead of escaping it. I reminded myself that discomfort was not danger. It was growth asking to be acknowledged. One weekend, I visited my childhood neighborhood alone. Walking those familiar streets, I realized how early I had learned to be the easy one, the quiet one, the reliable one. It had kept peace then. But I was no longer that child. I sat on a bench and allowed grief to surface, not for what I lost, but for what I never received. Care without conditions. Listening without urgency. I didn't blame anyone. Understanding replaced resentment. When I stood to leave, I felt lighter. Not because the past was resolved, but because it no longer defined my future. I wasn't rewriting my story. I was continuing it, this time, as an active participant. Connection returned to my life in unexpected forms. Not louder, not demanding, but steady. I formed friendships where silence wasn't awkward and honesty didn't require justification. We spoke openly about limits, about exhaustion, about choosing ourselves without apology. One evening, during a quiet dinner with a new friend, she said something simple: "You don't disappear when you talk." I smiled, unsure at first what she meant. Later, alone, I understood. I was present in my own life now. Fully. I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me from fatigue or loneliness. I became attentive to myself instead. When I needed comfort, I rested. When I needed expression, I spoke. When I needed change, I acted. Kaylin faded into memory, not as a mistake, but as a chapter that taught me something essential. Love that requires silence costs too much. Love that grows with honesty, even if it ends, is still valuable. I didn't emerge stronger in the way stories often promise. I emerged softer, more aware, more rooted. I learned that being the strong one was never my destiny, it was a role I had outgrown. Standing at the window one final time, city lights reflecting back at me, I felt grounded. Not because life was easy, but because it was mine. And that, I finally understood, was enough. There was a moment, quiet and almost forgettable, when I realized I no longer waited for permission to exist. It happened on a rainy afternoon when plans were canceled last minute. The old version of me would have rushed to fill the time, call someone, help someone, be needed somewhere. Instead, I stayed in. I listened to the rain. I made soup slowly. I let the day be unfinished. That was new. I began trusting my own rhythm. Some days I felt open and social. Other days I needed distance. I stopped judging either version of myself. Rest was no longer something I earned after exhaustion. It was something I allowed before breaking. At work, a younger colleague asked how I managed pressure so calmly. I paused before answering. "I don't carry what isn't mine," I said. The words surprised us both. I realized I wasn't teaching her resilience. I was modeling self-respect. There were still moments when old instincts surfaced. When someone sighed heavily, hinting for help. When silence felt like responsibility. But now I noticed the impulse instead of obeying it. I chose consciously. And that choice felt powerful in a quiet, grounded way. One night, lying in bed, I thought about how often people confuse strength with endurance. How many lives are built on silent suffering mistaken for capability? I wished I could tell my younger self that being strong doesn't mean being available at all costs. Tears came not from pain, but from compassion for who I had been. I let them fall without wiping them away quickly. There was no one to reassure. No one to protect from my truth. Just me, finally allowing myself to feel fully. Time didn't fix everything, but it softened the edges. I became someone who could sit with discomfort without rushing to solve it. Someone who could hear a request and decide, honestly, whether I had space. My world grew smaller in some ways, quieter. But it also grew deeper. Conversations felt more real. Laughter felt earned. Silence felt safe. One afternoon, I received a message from Lisa. Not a crisis. Not a vent. Just a simple check-in. "Thinking of you," it read. I smiled. This was different. Balanced. Mutual. I replied without urgency, without guilt. Just warmth. Looking back, I saw how invisible my struggle had been, not because it was small, but because I hid it well. I had mistaken survival for success. I had confused being needed with being loved. Now, love felt different. It showed up as respect, as listening, as space. And when it didn't, I no longer tried to reshape myself to fit. Standing once more by the window, the city familiar yet changed, I felt steady in my own presence. Not performing, not enduring, just living. I didn't become someone extraordinary. I became someone honest. And that honesty gave me something I had searched for in others for years: peace. Not loud, not perfect, but real. Peace didn't mean the absence of fear. It meant fear no longer decided for me. I still felt it when stepping into unfamiliar spaces, new conversations, new expectations, new versions of myself. But now, fear sat beside me instead of standing in front of me. I accepted an invitation to speak at a small work gathering about stress and balance. The old Iria would have overprepared, carrying the responsibility of saying the right thing for everyone. This time, I spoke simply. I shared how I once believed being dependable meant never needing help. I admitted how that belief had quietly emptied me. The room stayed silent longer than I expected. Then someone nodded. Another person exhaled deeply. I realized people weren't waiting for solutions. They were waiting for honesty. That moment stayed with me. Later that evening, walking home under soft streetlights, I felt a quiet pride. Not the sharp kind that demands recognition, but the gentle kind that comes from alignment. I had spoken without shrinking, without over-explaining, without apologizing for taking up space. I thought about how many years I had lived slightly bent, adjusting myself to fit into other people's comfort. Straightening up didn't make me taller. It made me visible to myself. At home, I cooked dinner slowly, music low in the background. There was no one to impress, no role to maintain, just presence. I understood then that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a series of small choices repeated daily. I wasn't fixed. I was becoming. And for the first time, that felt enough. One morning, while cleaning, I found an old photo tucked into a book. It showed me years ago, smiling, composed, eyes tired in a way I hadn't noticed back then. I held the photo for a long moment, feeling both tenderness and distance. I didn't feel regret, only gratitude. That version of me had survived long enough to reach this one. I placed the photo back gently and closed the book. The past didn't need to be erased to lose its power. It only needed to be understood. Later, sitting by the window again, I reflected on what strength meant now. Strength was saying, I don't have space today. Strength was resting without guilt. Strength was letting people misunderstand you instead of betraying yourself to be liked. I no longer waited to be chosen, noticed, or rescued. I chose myself daily in quiet ways that didn't look impressive from the outside, but felt steady on the inside. Life continued, imperfect and unpredictable. But I trusted myself within it. That trust was new. And it was everything. I had learned that being the strong one had once kept me safe. But learning to be honest, truly honest, set me free. And in that freedom, I finally understood something simple and lasting. I didn't need to disappear to be loved. I only needed to stay. Staying did not mean holding on to everything. It meant choosing what deserved my energy and letting the rest pass without chasing it. I noticed how often life tested this new resolve. Someone would hint at disappointment. Another would expect immediate availability. The old reflex still stirred, but it no longer ruled me. One evening, after a long day, my phone buzzed repeatedly. A message asking for help, urgent in tone but familiar in pattern. I read it, felt the familiar tightening in my chest, and then placed the phone face down. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. I needed rest more than I needed approval. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. There was a strange comfort in not reacting, in trusting that the world would not collapse if I paused. The next day, when I responded calmly and honestly, nothing terrible happened. The request adjusted. Life moved on. I smiled at how much fear had once lived in such small moments. I began to see how much space I had gained by stepping back. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to imagine a future that wasn't built entirely around being useful. I enrolled in a short writing course, something I had postponed for years. Not to achieve anything, just to explore. Sitting among strangers, sharing words that came from a quieter, truer place, I felt something open inside me. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't performing resilience. I was simply participating in my own life. And that felt like progress worth protecting. The final shift came not with a decision, but with acceptance. One morning, as I prepared for the day, I caught my reflection and paused. I looked calm, not guarded, not tired in that old, familiar way, just present. I thought about all the versions of me that had existed, each doing her best with what she knew. None of them were wrong. They were stepping stones. I stepped outside into the moving city, feeling grounded in my body, aware of my pace. I no longer rushed to match others. I trusted my own timing. Later that day, sitting alone in a quiet cafe, I wrote one final line in my journal. I choose myself without apology. There was no dramatic ending to my story. No applause. No sudden transformation. Just a steady sense of belonging to myself. I understood now that strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It shows up as consistency, as honesty, as the courage to remain visible in your own life. I finished my coffee, gathered my things, and walked forward, not searching, not proving, just living. And that was enough. The story didn't end because life became perfect. It ended because I finally stopped leaving myself behind.